In this lecture module, we'll turn our attention to B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner's view is sometimes called radical behaviorism, but he actually referred to it as functionalism. So historians classify him, Burius Frederick or Fred Skinner, as a neo-behaviorist, but he's very strongly associated with behaviorism. Whereas Watson rejected Thorndike's law of effect as too subjective, Skinner creates a systematic objective formulation of the learning paradigm under the name of operant conditioning. Skinner embraces operant conditioning precisely because it allows for active and relatively unstructured learning. Skinner and Watson share another commonality in that they don't really want to look at any intervening variables or any conscious aspects of mental behaviors. Instead, they want to focus exclusively on overt observable behaviors, and they want to explain those behaviors by reference to laws of conditioning. Skinner's adaptation of operant conditioning, because it is active and can occur in a relatively unstructured environment, and also because it can allow for much more complicated forms of behavior to be learned, gives him a great deal more flexibility in dealing with differential and adaptive responses and understanding behavior, both in animals and humans. Unlike Watson, he doesn't understand behavior as something elicited by environmental stimuli. He holds that contingent environmental reinforcement selects behavior, where behavior consists in operations on the environments. He writes his famous book, The Behavior of Organisms, in 1938, while at his first job at the University of Minnesota. He reformulates Thorndike's law of effect so that it describes environmental selection of behavior through the reinforcement of the behavior's consequences. He makes no reference to subjective states like desires, drives, and so on in characterizing reinforcement. The picture below here is a picture of a relatively modernized Skinner box, where an animal receives positive or negative reinforcement when the animal, in this case a rat, exhibits a behavior that the experimenter wants to reinforce or teach. Operant conditioning is simply Thorndike's law of effect, though it isn't quite as straightforward and symmetrical as Thorndike originally presented it. In operant conditioning, a creature's behavior, often random behavior, is either positively or negatively reinforced, either through reward or through punishment. The probability of the behavior occurring again when the organism is again in the relevant eliciting conditions increases or decreases in proportion to the number of behavior reinforcement pairings. For example, a cage might be divided into two sections. Whenever a rat wanders into one section, experimenters administer an electric shock, like a foot shock. Over time, the probability that that rat will, for instance, leave that section of the cage whenever placed there increases in proportion to the number of negative reinforcement cage location pairings. Again, we're lucky enough to have a movie wherein this time Skinner describes and defends his view.
Can pigeons read? This one gives every indication, because he's been taught to distinguish between two words and to behave appropriately. He's learned his different response to each sign by being rewarded with food. So the bird isn't acting independently. Its behavior is shaped by controlling its environment. The first task was to isolate an individual piece of behavior and see how that could be changed. Skinner did this by keeping individual pigeons at about 3/4 of their normal weight, so that the birds were always hungry, and food could be used as an automatic reward. The pigeon was studied in a uniform box, one it quickly grew used to. One piece of behavior, pecking a coloured disc, was measured on a graph. The pigeon learned that pecking the disc produced a reward. Then the behavior of pecking could be studied in relation to how often that reward was offered, or in Skinner's terms, What was the schedule of reinforcement?
The main thing is what we call schedules of reinforcement. Reinforcement is what the layman calls reward, and you can schedule it so that a reward occurs every now and then when a pigeon does something. We usually use a response with a pigeon pecking a little disc, a little spot in the wall, and you can reinforce with food, but you don't reinforce every time. Perhaps every 10th time, or perhaps only once every minute or something like that. There are a very large number of schedules, and they have their special effects. And there is a good example of how you can move from the pigeon to the human case, because one of the schedules which is very effective with rats or pigeons is what we call the variable ratio schedule, and that is at the heart of all gambling devices, and it has the same effect. The pigeon can become a pathological gambler just as a person can. Now, the fact that we found that out with pigeons and could prove it by removing and changing the schedule makes it easy for us to interpret the case with the human subject. We don't say that the human subject gambles to punish himself, as the Freudians might say, or gambles because he feels excited when he does so. Nothing of the sort. People gamble because of the schedule of the reinforcement that follows, and this is true of all gambling systems. They all have variable ratios built into them. So what we've learned from the pigeon, it made it possible to interpret this vast field very effectively.
Where does that leave free will? Because we all think we have a choice whether to do things or not to do things.
Yes. Well, you see, it leaves it in the position of a fiction. We have assumed somehow or other that these internal states, feelings, and so on, have initiated something. They have started something. They have created. We have done something in a voluntary way. We have willed to act. If you now look at the actual history, we find that there are external reasons why this has happened. In other words, by discovering the causes of behavior, we can dispose of the imagined internal cause. We dispose of free will as an American divine of the 18th century, Jonathan Edwards, did. He said, we believe in free will because we know about our behavior, but not about its causes. And of course, it's the object of a science of behavior to discover causes. And once you have found those causes, there is less you need to attribute to an internal act or will, and eventually, I think, you need to attribute nothing to it.